It is the proletariat that is the decisive class in the struggle for the control of the means of production. You need a strong, disciplined organization to deal not only with the intellectuals, but with the millions and millions of peasants, with the middle class, and beyond that, with the bourgeoisie.
Hey folks, so I'm here with anarchist playwright Brenton Lengel, and we're going to do things a little bit differently than we normally do in our podcasts and interactions. Today, I wanted to do a podcast on the legacy of a very important communist in U.S. history named Sam Marcy. Now, Sam Marcy is not very well known, but he's very, very pivotal in the history of U.S. Marxism and leftism. And you know, people know me, I have my political views, but Brenton is an anarchist and is not a Marxist-Leninist and so that. So we're going to be getting Brenton's reaction as we go over different parts of Sam Marcy's life. So, sound fun, Brent?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I'm Brent, the anarchist on this podcast, who has no idea what the topic will be about.
So, well, let me ask you, what do you know about Sam Marcy, point blank?
Absolutely nothing. I had never heard of him until you contacted me and said you wanted to do this podcast. So everything you guys are going to be getting from me is 100% straight off the dome.
Okay. Well, there are 5 organizations in the United States at this time that have Marcyite roots and are based on Sam Marcy's teachings. There's the Workers' World Party, which is the party he started, which, in the interest of full disclosure, I was a member of for 8 years. Between 2007 and 2015, I was a member of that organization. No longer affiliated with them, disagree with them on many points, but regardless, there's the Workers' World Party, there's the Party of Socialism and Liberation, the PSL, there's the Communist Workers League, based in Detroit. There's something called Struggle for Socialism, Struggle La Lucha, Socialist Unity Party, which is in Baltimore and Los Angeles and different parts of the country. And now there's something called the New Orleans Workers Group, which, from what I understand, has been leading a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests in New Orleans. So this is a pretty impactful organization, and it's quite unique. You don't see formations like this in other countries. And let me just add that, you know, I'm not the most qualified person to be making this podcast, right? I never met Sam Marcy. He died in 1998 before I was politically active. I was 10 years old at the time. But, you know, there are people out there that are probably more qualified to do conversations like this than I am. And my challenge to those people is, please do podcasts, do interviews, go out there and tell your version of events. The sad thing about Sam Marcy's life is not a lot of it is written down. There's kind of an oral tradition. There's so many, you know, myths and legends and tall tales and such. And I almost feel like instead of calling this podcast The Legacy of Sam Marcy, I should call it The Legend of Sam Marcy.
That's exactly what you should call it. In fact, yeah. Get that up on iTunes right now.
The Legend of Sam Marcy, because, you know, I am, to the best of my ability, going to only repeat things that I heard from people that would swear they're absolutely true. And, you know, his obituary is out there. There are some memorial pieces that were written by supporters and detractors. But regardless, a lot of what I'm about to repeat on here is stuff that I heard. And, you know, I may have heard it wrong. And these kind of stories take on a life of their own. But I'm just going to jump right into it. And I'll go over one part and then I'll get your reaction. And I'll go over another part and we'll just go and talk about who he is and his lasting legacy, because it's quite interesting. You know, and as somebody who was deeply impacted by the organization that he created, I think this conversation is interesting. And there's a lot of debate on the internet now about the PSL in particular. You know, they're kind of the center of controversy. People see them as the flagship tanky party in the United States. So not much information is available about where they came from, et cetera. So I think we'll just jump right into it.
Absolutely, because I was aware of the WWP and the PSL. I wasn't aware of the 3 other parties you mentioned. So I'm sure I'm looking forward to it. There's going to be a version of this where he has a blue ox, and is he going to skate around on butter in a skillet?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's good communism.
Okay. So Sam Marcy was born in Ukraine, and he was born to a Jewish family in Ukraine. And when he was a small child, the Red Army saved his family, from what I understand. You know, the White Army during the Russian Civil War was very anti-Semitic. He was from a Jewish village. A lot of the villages in the Tsarist Empire were segregated. And the Red Army protected his village from pogroms and anti-Semitism. And he had some vague memories, from what I understand, in his childhood of being protected by the Red Army. You know, he moved to New York City, and as a teenager, he joined the Communist Party USA. And that was during the Great Depression. And, you know, during the early 1930s, he was a leader of the Young Communist League of Brooklyn. You know, he led some union struggles. And his name is not actually Sam Marcy, interestingly. His birth name was Sam Balan. But back then in the Communist Party, you adopted a fake last name. So he lived on Marcy Street in Brooklyn. So that's why he was known as Sam Marcy.
I've been to Marcy Street.
Yeah. What's it like? I've never been to Marcy Street.
Brooklyn is, because I spent most of my time in Harlem, and so like Brooklyn to me is all flat and industrial for the most part. So if I recall with Marcy Street, there's a lot of like converted factory space. There's a lot of fairly good graffiti, if I remember right. And I think my friends, I'm not sure, but I have a friend's art, like my friend has an art studio in that area. I don't know if it's exactly on Marcy Street, but I have the vague memory of getting off there and walking around. Overall, like, you know, I'm glad I didn't live there and I didn't move there, but, you know, very, very Brooklyn and very working class gentrified at this point.
And he was a very New York-centered kind of guy, from what I can understand. New York City was his home. You know, and his experience of, you know, fleeing Ukraine or the Russian Empire to the United States as a Jewish American, that's the story of many, many people in Brooklyn, right? Thousands and thousands of families have that story, right? I mean, that's very much a New York resident story. In his household, I believe he didn't grow up speaking English. He grew up speaking Russian in his household. And he had a kind of a thick Brooklyn/Russian accent his whole life.
It must have sounded amazing.
Yeah, well, there's video of him out there. I mean, and he's, you know, in his 80s, and at the time this video that's available is out there. But he has kind of a, you know, that thick, you know, accent. But he quit the Communist Party USA in 1934, I believe. And that was the year that Hitler came to power in Germany. And he felt that the Communist Party had not reacted properly to it. That you know, why was there not an uprising or an armed civil war against Hitler? Why had the communists not been able to form a united front with the Social Democrats to stop Hitler? And that was the official reason we always heard for him resigning from the Communist Party USA. It was over the rise to power of Hitler and the inability of the Communist Party to stop it. There may have been other stuff going on. Like, we understand at that point the Communist Party was really trying to push the idea of being a quote-unquote American organization, and that guys like him that had foreign accents and were Jewish and were not born in the United States were kind of getting, you know, marginalized, while, you know, people like William Z. Foster and Earl Browder were kind of pushed to the front. They were constantly being accused of being a Russian, you know, agent group. And so there was this big effort to emphasize how American they are. And he didn't like that about the Communist Party. Even up into his 80s and 90s, he would talk about how awful that was, the Communist Party, to pretend to be so American when their membership was African-American and immigrant and such. And he didn't like that.
And communism is, by definition, an internationalist ideology.
Yeah. Yeah, so he joined the Trotskyist movement. And he went to law school. He became a lawyer. He got a law degree. I don't know if he ever practiced law, but he was a legal advisor for labor unions. But he joined the Trotskyist movement, and you know, he was in what eventually became the Socialist Workers' Party in New York City. But he never really fit in with the New York City Trotskyist movement, mainly because the New York City Trotskyist movement was largely intellectuals. So do you want to kind of react to that and what you think of so far of the story?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like Trotskyites, or how, you know, I didn't know too many of them, like at Occupy. I think the one Trotsky follower that I knew, like at OWS, was when we were trying to save the Yippie. One of the ideas was that there was a Trotskyist who had a decent amount of money and might be interested in purchasing the space to keep it a radical space, but he owned a bunch of tiki bars. So if he had purchased it, he would have turned the Yippie into a radical space / tiki bar.
Wow.
Which seems to be the most Trotskyite thing I can think of for some reason.
Yeah, but that's not how he would have seen it, right? I mean, the New York City wing of Trotskyism was very much dominated by like college professors and academics, and he didn't quite fit in with them. And it's interesting because, you know, in 1939, there was a very important split in the history of Trotskyism, right? Leon Trotsky was exiled from the Soviet Union. He was living for a while. He lived in France and then in Mexico, and then he was assassinated. But, you know, Trotsky always maintained the Soviet Union was what he called a deformed or degenerated workers' state, that it was socialist in its foundations. It was just led by a Stalinist bureaucracy. But in 1939, the Stalin-Hitler Pact, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was signed. And many Trotskyists thought that was a sign that the Soviet Union was completely no good. And the New York City Trotskyists were kind of the leaders of that disagreement with Trotsky over that question. And the leader in New York City who emerged as kind of the leader of New York City Trotskyism was a guy named Max Shachtman. And Max Shachtman, interestingly, he's like the mirror opposite of Sam Marcy, right? Sam Marcy becomes a Trotskyist, and then gradually throughout his life, he becomes more and more hardline and tanky, right? Whereas Max Shachtman becomes a Trotskyist and then eventually becomes more anti-Soviet and eventually lays the basis for neoconservatism. Most of the neocons were followers of Max Shachtman. So
well, yeah, and I mean, you even saw that happen with like what's his face, Christopher Hitchens, who identified as a Trotskyist and then became one of the main people behind the justification of the war in Iraq. So like that totally makes sense. You know, what's very interesting, like to me as an anarchist and as somebody who's like looking out on it, you know, when I first came to communism, I sort of eased my way in. Like I didn't even consider myself an anarcho-communist for the longest time because I just wanted to stay away from the term. And it took me like, I guess, realizing that unions had been gutted and they weren't as radical as they used to be, and it would be almost impossible to rebuild them to what they had been when, you know, anarcho-syndicalism was like a really major political force. And that's one of the reasons why I switched to anarcho-communism. But like looking at Trotsky and the figure of Trotsky, a couple things have always stuck out to me. One, there's a great speech he gave called like "If America Should Go Communist." Yeah. And all the Americans, if you haven't read it, go read it, like, because he's basically like, if America goes communism, they'll be the best in the world at it. And I'm like, that's how you appeal to Americans.
Well, Trotsky said New York City was the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged. And he lived in New York City a long time before the Russian Revolution.
I believe that.
And he was very popular among like Russian exile communities. He had a daily newspaper called Novy Mir, which means new world or new peace. And, you know, I mean, it's very interesting. But so Sam Marcy was in the Trotskyist movement, and there was this big debate over was the Soviet Union still socialist or not. And most of the New York City Trotskyists took the position that it wasn't. He took the position that it was, and he was kind of marginalized in the New York City Trotskyist movement. But he became friends with a Broadway Shakespearean actor named Vince Copeland, who had been in the Communist Party, and the two of them became friends, and they both, you know, he converted this guy to being a Trotskyist. And they didn't fit in the New York City Socialist Workers Party. So they moved, right before World War II, they moved to Buffalo, New York, you know, way upstate New York by the Canadian border. And they got jobs in a steel mill. And the idea was there was no Socialist Workers Party in Buffalo yet. They were going to start their own branch of the Socialist Workers Party that would be kind of in line with their view that was much more positive on the Soviet Union than most Trotskyists were. And that's, you know, that was the beginnings of what you could call Marcyism as a political grouping. As he and Sam Marcy's a spouse, a woman named Dorothy Ballin, and Vincent Copeland, they all moved to Buffalo, New York to start a new branch of the SWP. And then, of course, World War II broke out. And during World War II, it was like completely illegal to go on strike or anything like that. So the country, they couldn't do much organizing then. I understand they did lead some wildcats or something. But after the Second World War, the Cold War got going. And, you know, he had a branch of the Socialist Workers Party. And, you know, McCarthyism was going on, so they had to operate very, very secretly. But he opened a storefront, from what I understand. They had a storefront in Buffalo. And it was in Buffalo, New York, apparently the white community and the black community, it's like there's one street that goes right down the middle. That's, you know, the line between the white and black community. That's where they put their storefront. And They didn't call it the Socialist Workers' Party because that would have been illegal. They called it like the Mothers Committee Against Racism or something like that. But it had a pool table in it, and he intended this like little, you know, storefront, bookstore, or whatever, to be kind of a working class hangout. What it became more than that, though, it was kind of a place for a lot of the university students and radicals to hang out. And it was the Buffalo branch of the Socialist Workers' Party. But everyone started to notice that the Buffalo branch of the Socialist Workers' Party acted completely different than the other branches of the Socialist Workers' Party. For example, you know what, that was at the time when the Communist Party USA, they were the Stalinists, they were the Soviet Party, they were like public enemy number one. So the attitude of most of the Socialist Workers' Party was to be like, see, we're the good communists, not like those bad ones, and to just constantly be condemning the Communist Party. Whereas Sam Marcy's attitude was whatever the Communist Party was doing, they should try to do it better. They should try to like outdo the Communist Party. Like they formed a Free the Rosenbergs committee, and they joined with the Communist Party to protest against the Taft-Hartley anti-labor law. They joined the Civil Rights Congress, which was the Communist Party's civil rights organization. And their attitude was very, very different. It was kind of like whatever the Communist Party is doing, we're going to like outdo them, and that's the way to show we're more revolutionary. What do you think of that?
I think that is way more healthy than most of what we have to deal with, like with the left today, where, you know, just everybody is out for blood most of the time and looking to, you know, instead of attacking the right and instead of building socialism of any kind, we mainly, you know, eat our babies. And so I'm very much on board with this, because this seems to be a very positive way to invoke that rivalry, where you don't like the other group, but you know your goal is not to make them worse, but to make yourself better. And I think that sounds like a really good way forward, and that's already something that I find attractive about this approach. I also, you know, I like that he set up the working class hangout. I'm not surprised it turned into a place for, you know, radical students to hang out at instead. That seems to be the way things go a lot of the time, where the youth is looking for something, not necessarily all subsections of the working class. And then also, to a certain extent, you know, with communism or any kind of revolutionary ideology, it sometimes doesn't require a huge amount of education. Like anybody can understand it, but oftentimes to step outside of the society that we're in, it requires a certain level of education just to kind of get your head wrapped around thinking of another better way to live.
Indeed. Well, you know, as the Cold War continued, he increasingly was taking the Soviet side in Cold War issues. In Hungary.
And why do you think he was doing that? Why was he doing that as opposed to the other Trotskyists?
That was his political orientation, was that the Soviet Union, and he actually wrote a manifesto called The Global Class War and the Destiny of American Labor, where he argued that the U.S. working class, their destiny was tied in with the Soviet Union, right? That there was one global class struggle, and that the American workers, their struggles was tied in with the Soviet Union's struggle against American imperialism. And that was really integral to what he believed. And what's interesting is this manifesto that he wrote in 1948. The Workers' World Party has done their best to kind of keep it from ever being published. The only reason it's available on the internet is because it was leaked by ex-members who left the group, and they were publishing it online. And so finally, now it's on the Marxist Internet Archive. You can read it without the crappy introduction written by ex-members and stuff. But the language that's in that document is very Trotskyist. He quotes Trotsky. He refers to the CP as the Stalinists. And he speaks very critically of the Soviet government in ways their publications wouldn't do in later years, which is interesting. But yeah, he wrote this manifesto. 1956. That was after the death of Stalin. Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev in 1956 gave this tirade against Stalin at the 20th Party Congress. The Trotskyists generally said, "This is great. This proves we were right about Stalin all along." Sam Marcy interpreted that speech as groveling before Western imperialism. He saw that as the Soviet leaders saying, "Don't worry, we're not radicals like Stalin. We want to negotiate. And he saw that speech as a step backward, not as a step forward. The other thing was, in Hungary in 1956, there was an uprising against the socialist government. The Soviet Union sent troops in to crush it. And Sam Marcy basically argued that some of the positions of the revolt were justified. There were things the Soviet Union had done that were wrong in Hungary, But ultimately, the revolt was led by the CIA and Nazi sympathizers, so the Soviet Union was justified in sending troops to crush it, which, of course, was not the position of the Trotskyist movement. The Trotskyist movement saw it as a righteous revolt against a Stalinist bureaucracy. And so, after that, after the Khrushchev secret speech, and then the other big disagreement was, at the time, the Socialist Workers' Party was having a petition to send the U.S. military to the South to protect the civil rights movement. Right? They had a petition called "Troops to the South," and Sam Marcy argued that sending the U.S. military into the South would just lead to further repression of black people, and that calling for the U.S. military to go to the South made sense during the U.S. Civil War and such, but in this current time, that would lead to further repression of the black community. And so, based on not wanting troops sent to the U.S. South, not supporting the Hungarian uprising, not admiring Khrushchev, Sam Marcy, 1959, they ultimately broke away and formed a new party called the Workers' World Party that was separate from the Socialist Workers' Party. What do you think of that?
I think overall, I think history might have borne him out as being a little bit wrong about not sending the troops, because, obviously we remember that the troops were necessary for integration. Like, the South was not going to allow that to happen otherwise. And we have all, seen that famous picture of the troops leading I forget her name, but the first black young woman to attend school. So I can see why he might have thought that, but hindsight is 20/20. It's interesting that you bring up Hungary, because Hungary is a country. My family is actually from Hungary, wow. My father's side. Yeah, there's actually a town called Lengel that I assume I will go back to there and be like, "Hello, everyone. Thank you for keeping my town. Get out, or I'll release the dogs." But Hungary is an interesting country because I think, if I'm not mistaken, Sebastian Gorka wears the Hungarian medals of his fascist father or grandfather or something from Hungary. So there's definitely this creeping right-wing element that was tied in with the CIA uprising, if I'm remembering this correctly. So, yeah. I try not to take a position on countries on the other side of the world that I have not personally visited and don't know much about. But what I would say is that he seems like he did have a decent amount of awareness about what, would have been, I guess, what may have been going on and what the ultimate outcome of that kind of revolution might be, even, because it's like taking the poison pill. War makes strange bedfellows, but you have to be careful who your allies are, because that determines what's going to happen if you win. So I think there's that. Overall, he seems to be an interesting guy. He's got a lot of very strong opinions, and I really wonder if the reason he stuck with the Soviets goes back to the fact that he did have that memory of the Red Army saving him as a child. I mean, that can be an incredibly powerful. Already you're telling me about this guy. If I'm writing a movie about his life, that's the scene I open on.
Yeah. Well, we can only speculate. I mean, we can only speculate. But that was his position, that the Soviet Union was on the right side of the global class war. But I will add, I'll reflect a little bit on his personality, because, again, I never met him. So I'm only telling you things I've heard. And for everything I've heard something that contradicts, what I've heard. So, but one thing is that, the gay rights movement didn't start until 1969. But from what I understand, even back in the 50s and 40s, he kind of had an instinct that homophobia was bad. There was somebody in the party who was bad-mouthing somebody else and saying that they're gay, and he told them not to do that. That was a reactionary thing to do. There was somebody apparently making fun of somebody who was male but kind of effeminate around the office, and he said, "You don't do that here. We don't reinforce gender oppression here." And he kind of had that feeling, and he was always a very big supporter of black nationalism. I actually came across in the archives of the Workers' World one time a huge, long article he'd written on why Jews should support Minister Farrakhan. And even though Farrakhan had said these anti-Semitic things, why it was necessary for Jewish people to support a black nationalist leader like Minister Farrakhan. And that was in the 1980s that he wrote that. And that he really kind of had a really big admiration for black nationalism. Now some people also describe him as being, a little bit as what we might call on the spectrum these days, right? Like supposedly he didn't work in that steel mill for very long. Is that, in a steel mill, there's all kinds of big equipment and, dangerous hot metal and all kinds of stuff around you. And apparently he got into some accidents because he was kind of daydreaming and thinking about politics. So the other comrades urged him to just, get a legal job as a lawyer and not work in the steel mill because he might die. He might get injured, because he was just too spacey. There's a story of
sounds like me.
Yeah, there's a story of one time he was in an office, he was at the party office, and somebody ran in and he was reading a book, and somebody ran in and said, Sam, a whole bunch of people just got arrested and beaten up by the police, and I'm going to go try to find a lawyer, and I can't believe it. And he looked up and he said, that's great, and looked back down at his book.
Hit me.
But then I hear things that are the opposite about him. I hear that he was the kind of guy who could just, he could talk to anybody. People say he was like one of the most personable kind of people. He just had a charm about him. He could make friends with anyone. And that he even said that a communist is the kind of person who can talk to anybody. And he said it was really necessary to be able to talk to people from all different walks of life. And he enjoyed kind of engaging with people who were not communists about politics. That gave him a great deal of pleasure to just talk to kind of average people on the street and get their opinions. So I don't really know. I never met him and I can't really comment on that. But regardless, so he started basically, the Buffalo SWP broke away and formed a new party, the Workers' World Party. The first, couple years of the newspaper, it actually had Trotsky's face in every issue. I kid you not. It had Lenin and Trotsky's face on the masthead. And the first issue of Workers' World newspaper actually denounces Fidel Castro as a bourgeois nationalist. And then the third issue of Workers' World newspaper actually attacks the Communist Party for supporting Fidel Castro and saying that Fidel Castro is an anti-communist and all of that. And he also, in the early years of the party, Martin Luther King was still alive at that point. And he had moved to New York City, was organizing this new party, very much a supporter of black nationalism. Malcolm X was also still alive in the early 60s. And so he reprinted in Workers' World scathing, nasty attacks on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from Malcolm X, from black nationalists. Martin Luther King is a sellout. Martin Luther King's an agent of imperialism. He's a phony. He printed that kind of thing, because he was trying to, show solidarity with black nationalists. And I think it's because of those kind of things that you won't, Workers' World will not release the entire archive of their newspaper on the web. I don't think they want people to know some of the early positions they took, like having Trotsky's face in every issue. He was very pro-Mao. He liked China and the Chinese Revolution, and immediately took their side in the Sino-Soviet split. And what's interesting is he tried to have a relationship with China. And so they went to the Chinese mission or some contact with the Chinese government, and they took Trotsky's face out of the newspaper because they knew that China really didn't like Trotsky. And so the Chinese, they gave them the newspaper and showed them all the glowing articles they'd written praising Mao. And they said, well, we'd like you to bring every copy of the newspaper. And so then they brought them some more back issues, and they said, no, we want you to bring every copy of the newspaper. So then they did bring every copy, and they saw the Trotsky face and never talked to them again. But he wanted to have a relationship with the Chinese government. And I guess the thing was that Trotsky had maintained at the time of his death that World War II would only end with a massive global workers' revolution, right? That's why the Spartacist League, for example, maintains that World War II is still going on because there was no massive global revolution. So therefore, the war must not have ended, which is ridiculous. But that's kind of how dogmatic people can be. And I guess Sam Marcy had argued that the revolution did happen at the end of World War II, and it was the Chinese Revolution, and it was Eastern Europe, and it was, and that what Trotsky had predicted didn't happen around the world, but it happened in China and the developing world. And that basically that Trotskyism was somehow being incarnated by Mao and Castro. Mao and Castro were the real Trotskyists. And so that meant never mention Trotsky because those guys hate Trotsky. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of a strange double thing. What do you make of that?
I find it very interesting that he led the paper with Trotsky's face, because if there's something about Trotsky you want to lead with, it would not be his face. I honestly, sometimes I look back at that and I'm just like, I sometimes wonder if Stalin was able to squeeze him out partially because he just had like a really nice mustache and very much looked the part, and Trotsky did not. Though apparently, if certain accounts of his death are to be believed, he was kind of a badass in his final moments. With after he got the ice pick, he was kind of like he stayed alive. He fought the attacker.
Oh,
He
wow.
made sure that his bodyguards did not kill the attacker because he had to stand trial, and then died.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if nothing else, if that's a true account, the man was hardcore. And he was the leader of the Red Army. He went through the Soviet Revolution. So I definitely believe that. But I think that it's interesting to see how the allegiances shift. Because it seems like he's taking positions based upon an attempt to build bridges with other movements. That's an interesting way, because I would say, I guess a way you could introduce yourself to somebody else on the left that you admire and want to work with by saying something nice about them. But I really find that real solidarity is built by collaborating as opposed to built ideologically. So I think maybe it might have been better to see who he could find and work with. Obviously, I definitely disapprove of him saying nasty stuff about Martin Luther King. One of the things that I've always taken about Martin Luther King, and one of the reasons why I believe that there needs to be a radical voice at all times calling for revolution of one kind or another, is that I feel like history, in a way, this is with it moves dialectically, both materially and ideologically. And I feel like if Martin Luther King had not had Malcolm X, if they had not both been there, Martin Luther King would have been treated as Malcolm X by the white establishment. But because you had Malcolm X making the more radical argument, and then you had Martin Luther King come in and make a more, I guess, a more traditionally ethical argument that was less radical, but he was still calling for an end to capitalism. The society was able to change, and the civil rights movement was able to happen, and we were able to make progress from where we were before the civil rights to where we were after. And there's still progress to be made, but I really feel like there needs to be multiple voices out there, each making their own different but still important radical arguments, and it's from that dialogue, essentially, from all of those voices together, that society will eventually create policy.
Right. Well, it's interesting. You talk about how you would have worked with people, and apparently that's a big part of Marxism, as he would say, socialism is as socialism does, and just kind of what are you doing in the street activism. And in the early 60s, when George Lincoln Rockwell, the neo-Nazi, was going around speaking, he formed something called the Anti-Fascist Youth Committee. And it was kind of Antifa before Antifa, right?
Oh, great.
And I guess George Lincoln Rockwell was going to speak in New York City. And so the Anti-Fascist Youth Committee, led by Workers' World Party, organized a demonstration of thousands of people who started, got bricks and bottles and were fighting the police and stuff. And they ultimately stopped him at the New Jersey border and wouldn't let him come into New York City because there was so much unrest. And the Anti-Fascist Youth Committee became Youth Against War and Fascism, which was kind of this street fighting youth group that Sam Marcy formed, right? It was this group of people that went to anti-war rallies and led kind of the more radical breakaway marches, kind of like what Black Bloc would do in more recent times. They were known to, sometimes they would even wear football helmets to the demonstrations because they expected to be clubbed. And they would wave the flag of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front and chant, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win. And they were, into property destruction and things like that. And from what I understand, that, at that time, there was in the late 60s, at least, there was a huge youth movement of young people that were kind of hippies and counterculture who went to rallies and protested and engaged in kind of street fighting kind of stuff. And most of the communist groups were pretty hostile to that. They said this is middle class, this is petty bourgeois, this is not getting to the workers. And that the Workers' World Party kind of distinguished itself as the only party that really kind of supported and embedded itself with with the street fighting, right? And that they were the only party to support the Days of Rage that the Weathermen staged in Chicago, for example. And that, they were known to do very provocative things in the streets. They had bright orange banners because back then newspapers were black and white. So if it was orange with black writing on it looked really good in the newspaper. They would raise the slogan, "Stop the war against Black America." And they would bring that to anti-war rallies and try to connect the struggle against the Vietnam War with the Black freedom struggle at home. And people knew them. They were known. People would call them the Maoist Trotskyites. That was kind of their nickname. Some people called them the Weather Trots after the Weathermen. And that they were just this kind of radical street fighting group. But that's the period where they really grew. For the early 60s, it was never more than 30 people. But by like 1969, 1970, the group was probably over 1,000 people, from what I can gather. It became a massive group because they embedded themselves in the street fighting, because they became kind of this group that was known for going out and being part of the street fighting. And that the members were older people, but they were kind of mentoring this younger generation of like boomers, who got involved in the street fighting. What do you have to say about that?
I mean, well, obviously anytime you talk about political violence, even defensive political violence, there is an element of, I suppose, there's an ethical element that you have to struggle with. And the idea of, you've got to struggle with the ethics of it. You also have to struggle with the optics of it. But also, what leads me to believe that what they were doing was ultimately pretty healthy, as far as such things can go, is that they grew as a result of that. Mm-hmm. And that says to me that, if they grow large enough to stop George Lincoln Rockwell from speaking, and to prevent, fascists were freaking huge. I mean, you remember that big KKK rally in New York City that Donald Trump's father was arrested at. There was a big history of like white supremacist like summer camps in New York State, and so the threat was very real. And it seemed to me like, I'm guessing they grew partially because people were looking for a way to defend their communities and defend themselves. And, I will, as a Buddhist, I am very much against the use of violence as much as possible because it creates negative karma. And as a result, you can't fight or kill your way to a better world. It seems like you can, but you can't. But at the same time, I'm not going to take issue with people defending themselves in their homes from fascists who are going to go in and do terrible things to them. So I find it very compelling. What I also find is that, again, I like the emphasis on action, on actually being in the community and doing things. This is something that's very appealing to anarchists, because anarchism, one of the major draws about it is direct action, is no longer waiting for permission to make the world a better place. And so I think that that's something that most anarchists would be very attracted to, taking a stand against fascism, against, these people that want to brutalize and harm and kill some of the most vulnerable citizens in society. So, in a way, that's God's work he's doing,
Yeah, well, he was certainly never afraid to take a hard stance. When the 1967 war happened, he, again, took the Soviet position opposing Israel in the 1967 war, supporting the Arab nationalist countries. And from what I understand, in New York City, that was a particularly hard stance to take. And then I heard the story of the Youth Against War and Fascism would hand out leaflets like "Stop Israel Aggression" or something. And it was very common for an older person who'd been through the Holocaust, to get that leaflet and start crying, and just see a leaflet condemning, and then just immediately have flashbacks to the Holocaust and start sobbing, and things like that would happen. And it was very, to take a stance against Israel so recently after the Holocaust and all of that was a hard line to take. But he was never afraid to take a hard line. I mean, he was very supportive of the Palestinians, a strong supporter of the Palestinians. He did on multiple occasions sit down with Fidel Castro at the United Nations and in Cuba. He went to Cuba, and Fidel Castro and him would sit down and have hour-long conversations. There's photographs of him and Fidel sitting together. He went to North Korea and met with Kim Il-sung several times. There's photographs of him and Kim Il-sung together as well. And he, again, it was kind of this feeling that the U.S. imperialists are always the enemy. So we will support any country that's fighting the imperialists. And that's interesting. And that's generally what the Workers' World Party was attacked for, right? That's the allegation of tankies. They support Soviet tanks wherever they go and such. And so he was never afraid to take that hard stance. But what's interesting is after the upsurge of the 1960s started to bog down, he started taking the Workers' World Party in a different direction. In 1974, there were the anti-busing riots in Boston, where the racists in Boston were, attacking school buses because they didn't believe in school integration. So the Workers' World Party organized a big march called "We Say No to Racism," and it was against the busing riots. And they called it "We Say No to Racism" because they wanted to show respect for black nationalists that didn't support busing. So it was just opposing the racism. It wasn't supporting busing, because that would be disrespectful to the Nation of Islam and groups that didn't support busing. And it was a way to just oppose the anti-busing movement without necessarily supporting school integration. And they called it "We Say No to Racism." And they didn't organize in their own name. I mean, it was the first time the party ever did anything that was kind of like, they didn't do it as the party. They almost kind of hid the fact that they were in the party. And Democrats spoke at the march, Democrat elected officials and such, and it was a rally against the Boston anti-racist busing riots. And in the 70s, they very much tried to become kind of an organization that was organizing around labor unions and community issues, and they tried to build something called the Center for United Labor Action that would be kind of a community group that would support labor unions and stuff. And they called this the face to the masses. But in a lot of ways, it meant basically concealing that you were a communist. The idea was to just build these kind of struggle organizations and that would attract people, but kind of hide that you were a communist. What do you think of that?
It kind of reminds me of what the alt-right does today, which I am very much someone that believes in the door in the face technique. I think it's important, again, like with Martin Luther King, it's important that people hear the radical argument. The idea that you should have to hide that you're a communist implies that there is something wrong with being a communist, and that people shouldn't want to be communists, and that you would have to trick someone into it, which is why the fascists do it today, and they call themselves identitarians. They change the name of their organizations. So I've always seen that as an inherently weak tactic. The other thing that I noticed is that, like, the say no to racism or no to racism, it almost reminded me of I don't know if you remember, but the flyers that originally got the alt-right super freaked out about the Antifa super soldiers were put out by the RCP, and they put in the name of humanity, say no to fascism. And they put them up, a little bit around New York City, and everyone was saying that on the day that the RCP was going to do, their tiny event, that was the day that Antifa was going to rise up, and all the alt-right, they went out of their minds. And I remember they were sitting there preparing and salivating over the prospect of fighting and killing their political enemies, or at least what they thought they would. And then when nothing happened, because obviously nothing was going to happen, they were like, we scared them off.
Well, I think part of the reason for the kind of the secret organizing was probably that they had lived through McCarthyism. And I think that was probably, the fact that Sam Marcy had been a political organizer during the time of McCarthyism, that caused, this kind of belief that you need to operate in secret.
That's a good point. What year was this?
Well, he was doing this in the 70s, and
okay. So shortly after, like, McCarthyism had been broken by the Yippie trial, where they tried to drag, like, Abby Hoffman through the mud, as they had with other people, throughout the 50s and early 60s. And, Abby Hoffman had already been heavily critical of the United States in public, so there was nothing they could really hit him with or make stick to him, and so they weren't able to ruin his life as they were able to ruin other people's lives with the House of Un-American Activities Committee. So it was broken, but I bet you there was still fear.
Yeah, and the 50s had been a key time when he learned to organize. That had been when the party was being formed and such, and so that was kind of how he understood to organize. And it was kind of, we're going to build these activist groups that organize around labor issues and anti-racism struggles, and people will join them, like us and become communists. It didn't exactly work out that way, though. People talk about Workers' World Party didn't exactly recruit. They did get a lot of people in the 80s, though, as the Maoist movement collapsed, right? The Maoist movement had been tied to China. And as China's politics shifted to the point of not really wanting an allied party in the United States, a lot of people who had been Maoists ended up joining the Workers' World Party. And there was a talk at one point, there was a Maoist group called the Communist Workers' Party. That was their members, 5 of their members were killed in broad daylight by the Ku Klux Klan in Greensboro, North Carolina. At the Greensboro Massacre, it was called.
I was about to say that, Greensboro Massacre.
Yeah, and after that, the Workers' World Party and the Communist Workers' Party talked about merging. They had kind of a relationship, but it didn't exactly work out. But they were very close. They were like on the brink of merging. But in 1981, they organized the People's Anti-War Mobilization, which was this huge anti-war demonstration in Washington, D.C. And it was a big anti-war rally, but they didn't do it in their name. If you read the press releases, you have no idea the Workers' World Party was involved. It was just PAM, People's Anti-War Mobilization. But it was the first national anti-war rally to have a gay and lesbian speaker, and it was the first national anti-war rally to have a Palestinian speaker. And what had happened was it used to be that the Socialist Workers' Party had organized these big anti-war rallies. But the Socialist Workers' Party kind of, they fell apart in the early 80s. So the Workers' World Party kind of stepped up to the plate. And that was kind of the role they started playing, was they got very good at organizing big protests in Washington, D.C., right? They kind of became the stage managers of the anti-war movement, They would have the marshals, they would get the permits, they would set up the stage. And that kind of became what they were good at, if you look at how they operated. And, starting really in the mid-'70s, but especially in the 80s, that kind of became what they were. They were the party that organized big rallies in Washington, D.C. And the idea that Sam Marcy said was they were going to take over the movement, and then they would take power, right? And in the final years of Marcy's life, that's a big theme. We're going to take over the movement, right? And that whatever was left over of the 60s anti-war movement, the Workers' World Party was going to position itself to be in control of the movement. They organized in Detroit something called the All People's Congress, which was a huge gathering in Detroit of leftist and progressive groups, kind of a 3-day mini conference in Detroit. They organized People's Movement Assemblies, they were called. They were gatherings. And the idea was that they were going to form these kind of like groups that were like coalitions that would be led by the Workers' World Party. And that very much became a theme in the later years of Marcy's life, up into the 90s. What do you make of that?
I can see that dynamic played out like online even now with tankies, and I'm speaking broadly. I'm talking about, like the stereotypical tankie that shows up in an anarchist space online. Everybody looks at him and, we have him around and stuff. And then we're like, that guy's going to try to take over this forum. Just you wait. and they always do. It's the weirdest thing. So and I don't mean always, but oftentimes I find with like the stereotypical kind of hardline tanky, there is this sort of idea that I'm a tank. I'm going to become the leader. I'm going to become the vanguard, and it may be a bit of this tactic kind of being communicated via cultural osmosis.
Well, what's also interesting is that they recruited heavily out of the gay rights movement. And I've mentioned this before, but Leslie Feinberg, who was the first transgender activist, was a leader of the Workers' World Party. And in the early 70s, they published a pamphlet by her called The Diary of a Transsexual. And that's considered to be the first trans rights pamphlet ever printed in U.S. history. And
good to hear it.
Yeah, they published that. But then, they recruited, and every issue of the Workers' World newspaper would have at least one article about the gay rights movement or something. But that didn't stop them from taking some hard stances, right? When Cuba was quarantining AIDS victims, they loudly defended Cuba's right to do that and said they also pushed the idea that AIDS was some kind of government conspiracy. Which was something that in many anti-imperialist countries that was widely believed. In the Soviet Union, that was believed. In Iraq, in Libya, people believed that, and they in their paper made that argument. They argued that. I don't know if they would say that now, but that was in the 80s. They were saying that in the 80s and 90s. That was kind of their position. When the Soviet Union fell, many people started to kind of mock them for the fact that they held out. Like, they kept saying it ain't over till it's over. Up until like 93, 94, they were saying, well, it's not over yet. Well, it was over. The Soviet Union fell, and that many people speculated that on some level, Sam Marcy had never really prepared the membership to believe that something like the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Eastern Bloc was possible. Like, they just had no idea what was coming. It was just something they couldn't foresee. And it was a big shock to the organization. And they were kind of, blown away by it in the 1990s. But they kept organizing. I mean, and they were very key in organizing for the movement to free Mumia Abu Jamal, for example. And what's rather interesting is, before Mumia Abu Jamal, there was something called the MOVE organization in Philadelphia, right, which was a kind of a black activist group. And there was the 1985 MOVE house bombing where their house was blown up. And Mumia had been involved with the MOVE group before he went to prison and such. But what's interesting is apparently Sam Marcy and Mumia Abu Jamal knew each other on a personal level in the late 70s. He would go to Philadelphia, and the MOVE organization and the Workers' World Party had some joint rallies. So there's apparently many times, Mumia Abu Jamal and Sam Marcy knew each other before Mumia became the world's most famous political prisoner, which I think is pretty wild. But especially in the 90s, they formed Millions for Mumia, which was an activist group that supported Mumia Abu Jamal. They were key in organizing a lot of the demonstrations that prevented Mumia Abu Jamal's execution. They went all over Europe, popularizing the case of Mumia Abu Jamal. And they saw, the struggle to free Mumia Abu Jamal and stop his execution as a way of defending the entire Black liberation struggle.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, this is getting into stuff that I'm starting to know about. Because Mumia al-Jamal, I had first heard about him before I got really involved on the radical left. I was working, and there was a play that was going up at Playwrights Horizons. And I'm trying to remember what it was called. I can't think of the name of it, but the plot of the play, essentially, and it was written by a liberal who did not understand the left at all, but it was supposed to be the next great lefty play. But it was centered around a character, like a young communist who was trying to free Mumia al-Jamal, and she went through this huge crisis when she found out that her grandfather had spied for Stalin. And she had this huge, and I'm like, why would a radical freak out about that? Like, even then, I wasn't even active, but I was like, that doesn't make sense. And even like in the play, I remember like one of the big crises of faith that finding out this fact about her grandfather that she was having. She's like, well, what if he actually committed the crime? And I'm just like, oh my God, like, that's not, it was such a liberal, like, the problem wasn't that whether or not he committed the crime. The problem was, did he get a fair trial? And I'm kind of like, isn't the problem the systemic attempts at destroying the Black community and enslaving the Black community in the United States?
Well, I think Mumia Abu Jamal is innocent. I think that the evidence shows the bullets weren't from his gun, and that even under Philadelphia law, by example, even if the prosecution's narrative is exactly correct, it's still not premeditated murder. In Pennsylvania, you have to get premeditated murder to get the death penalty. And even according to the prosecution's narration, the premeditation was 2 seconds before the trigger was pulled, right? I mean, he was pulled over and there was a scuffle with a cop and the cop died. Well, I don't think he killed the police officer. There's multiple witnesses that say there was another shooter who ran up to the scene and pulled the trigger. And many witnesses have recanted their testimony and said they were basically coerced by the police. But regardless, even if the prosecution's narrative of events is correct, he shouldn't get the death penalty. Right. And that many people talked about the Mumia exception and the power of the Fraternal Order of Police, basically, because it was a police officer who was killed. They had the ability to kind of twist the arm of the justice system and
which that is literally true, though. I mean, like, I'm actually listening to, there's a great podcast, Behind the Bastards, and they have done a 5-parter on like the history of law enforcement in the United States. And the most recent one that I was listening to just this morning was on like just how powerful police unions are and how they have managed to, I mean, completely stonewall any attempts at reforming police, and if a police officer gets killed, I mean, you even remember like with the Cecily McMillan trial where the police union tried, they were like, no, she should go to jail for 7 years for giving this officer a black eye. So I believe that 100% that they were actually able to go in there and twist some arms.
Yeah, well, regardless, I mean, Sam Marcy died in 1998. What's interesting is he was the leader of the Workers' World Party. And, right after 9/11, the Workers' World Party formed something called the Answer Coalition, Act Now to Stop War and End Racism.
I've heard of the Answer Coalition.
Right, and that was the main group that kind of facilitated, what they got very good at. It's, stage managing the anti-war movement. They stage managed the big anti-war rallies in D.C. during the invasion of Iraq. And I guess what happened was the folks that were the leaders of the Answer Coalition kind of felt like the rest of the Workers' World Party was holding them back. And so they kind of just said, screw you guys, we're leaving. And they formed the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And many people were disturbed as to why there was no manifesto or statement about why they resigned. But it wasn't really a political disagreement. It was simply about the control of the Answer Coalition. And I think that the people who started the Answer Coalition just felt like they didn't want to work with the Workers' World Party anymore, and it was just kind of a break that way. And that's where PSL comes from, by the way, the Party of Socialism and Liberation. I joined the Workers' World Party a few years after the split with PSL. And what I heard the entire time I was a member of the Workers' World Party was that PSL is racist. And I look back on that now and I think, okay, PSL, you can disagree with them and all of that. I don't think they're racist. I think Ku Klux Klan, PSL, no, doesn't go together, But that was kind of the way the party developed, is basically anybody who disagreed with the party was racist. That kind of became the culture. And, people talk now about ID poll. Well, yeah. I mean, I was around before ID poll was a big thing on the left. It was a big thing in the Workers' World Party. There was a lot of, we have to have people of this nationality on this panel. You don't have the right to criticize this international leader if you're white, et cetera. And that was a big part of the way that they saw things. And there seemed to be always kind of internal battles going on with somebody being accused of being racist or sexist or homophobic. And one of the criticisms of Marcy's leadership was, there was never any bylaws. There was never any constitution for the party. It was always just kind of his network of activists. But there was also not an atmosphere where people could disagree and argue about party line.
No, on the left, that didn't happen.
Yeah, there was very much an atmosphere where it was like disagreements happened in the coffee shop. Disagreements happened, outside. And then the internal meetings were almost just like internal rallies where everyone just applauded for everything. And, if you got up and said, hey, I disagree with that, the room would kind of go silent. And then afterwards, someone would come up to you and say, that was really uncomradely and disrespectful for you to challenge our leadership like that. And they kind of created this atmosphere where they couldn't really debate or wrangle with issues. And again, no bylaws, no constitution. And while Sam Marcy was alive, I get the impression he was kind of the absolute, ruler of the party. I mean, it was not written down anywhere, but it was his word was law, kind of, and that the National Committee meetings would begin with him speaking for several hours, and then everyone would get up and try to outdo each other in praising what he had said and agreeing with them. And he, on some level, knew that was wrong. And he wrote a document called From a Tendency to a Party, basically saying the Workers' World Party was not a party, and that it was actually just a tendency. It was a group of people who were activists who had similar ideas, but it wasn't really a party. That to be a party, they needed to have factions and disagreements and stuff. But then that never really happened. And I know that in the early 90s, at one point, he mobilized the entire membership to go after the Detroit branch of the party. And it was almost like people likened it to a public execution or something. It was like the whole membership from around the country, people came in on buses and trains to have a big meeting about how Detroit had disrespected Sam Marcy and how unprincipled that was. And person after person got up and gave a speech about how disrespectful the Detroit branch had been or something. And it was, there very much was a cult of personality. But then again, let me tell you, just like everything with Sam Marcy, there's always the opposite, right? Many people in the party wanted to name their kids after him, right? Marcy or Sam or whatever. He would never allow it. He would get very angry, right? At one point, somebody painted a picture of him, and he found it hanging on the office wall, and he was furious. He said, take this down. We're not going to do this. So on some level, he didn't want there to be a cult of personality around himself. He wrote this document basically saying we're not really a party because we don't have disagreement and factions. But then he did kind of, rule with an iron fist from what people, it's complicated, right? It's not exactly clear, and, a lot of these left groups are kind of more or less little personality cults. I mean, Bob Avakian is the most blatant example, but...
Yeah, where he literally says, oh, yes, it is a personality cult. We've been working to build that personality.
Right. But, for many
at least he admits it.
Yeah. For many of these groups, though, they do have one charismatic leader who is seen as kind of, the organization. And, I mean, what do you make of that?
It's like the opposite problem of what we had at Occupy Wall Street, where, anarchists tend to, a lot of us like the spotlight and like to go out and do things, but we have a instinctive distrust of power and even charismatic power. So it can become a situation where no one wants to take initiative and no one wants to take responsibility. It's so almost a too many cooks style situation. Whereas here it seems like people are so eager to find somebody to follow, to tell them how to think and how to act and what to do, that they're even necessarily perhaps going slightly against that guy's wishes. I definitely, if I was running a party and someone had painted a picture of me, I don't think I would have gotten mad and said, take this down. I would have said, oh, this is a wonderful picture. Thank you so much for painting it. I'm going to keep this in my home. I don't think I think it would be way better in my home than here at the office, because but I mean, that's honestly, as an artist myself, and as somebody who knows painters, that's a really sweet thing for somebody to do,
Sure.
to put in the time, even if it's not a very good painting, you really should honor that, even if it's not a good idea, because you're not trying to build a cult of personality around yourself.
Yeah, I mean,
Caleb subscribers, paint pictures of Caleb.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess when I look over Sam Marcy's life, right, and now we've got 5 different Marcy groups in the United States. It seems to me like, I mean, there's a lot of contradiction there, right? I mean, in his mind, he was the one true Trotskyist in the world. To be a real Trotskyist, you never quote Trotsky, you never read Trotsky, you hang out with Stalinists. And I remember I actually said at one point when I was in the group, I said to somebody in the group, I said, did Sam Marcy maybe have magical glasses on when he read Trotsky or something? Because every other Trotskyist group in the world reads Trotsky to say the opposite of what Sam Marcy says. There is not a single other person in the world who reads Trotsky the way he reads it. And I was told by somebody that said, if you want to be in this group, you just can't think that way. And I mean, there you go. And that there was a lot of contradiction there. And that again, it kind of, sometimes you read Sam Marcy, he sounds like a real Trotskyist. He says things like Stalin killed millions of peasants and things like that. Other times you listen to him, he sounds like the most hardline, tanky. He praises Stalin's organizational ability and such. There's sometimes Sam Marcy sounds like a third worldist. It seems like he's, it's the colonized people of the world against the imperialists. But other times he sounds almost like a labor reformist kind of, and he's supporting the labor movement, and he's all about, trade unions and how well they're doing. And so he was all over the place, and he was a very charismatic individual, very brilliant. The greatest tragedy is that so little of his work is available. I know for a fact that in New Jersey, there is a storage locker full of hours and hours of video and audio cassettes and not just cassettes, but reel-to-reel audio tapes of his speeches back in the early 60s and such. And it's a shame it won't go up on the internet. I don't know what'll ever happen to it, but I don't think it'll ever go up on the internet. I think that the current leadership of Workers' World Party doesn't want it out there for their own reasons. But it's a real shame, because I feel like his life is an interesting case study in American communism. Probably my biggest criticism of him, if I could make one, and I feel like as somebody who was in the group for 8 years, I have the right to do that, even though I'll probably make loads of people mad by saying that. If I could make one criticism of him, is I feel like, especially in the final years of his life when he was talking about taking over the movement, he seemed a little bit out of touch with America as a country. He was from an immigrant family. He spent his whole life in communist groups, and he didn't quite understand that there are red states in this country, that there are, outside of urban centers, there are, suburbs and rural areas. And that there's all kinds of people in the United States who've never met a communist and could never imagine any reason why anyone would be a communist. And, especially in the most recent years, if you open, the Workers' World newspaper, I used to get frustrated in the group, and I would say to them, open the latest issue of Workers' World newspaper. Now, imagine you're not a communist. Is there anything in this publication that would convince you to be a communist? And there's not. I mean, it's your typical,
No.
yeah, your typical issue is a protest happened here, a protest happened there. A lot of times they don't even explain the issue that the protest is around. They assume you know who Mumia is or whatnot. And there was kind of this bubble that leftists get into. And Sam Marcy, as much as I feel like he was a little bit sharper and he was able to engage with ordinary people more than a lot of their members were, from what I've heard, again, that there was still that kind of bubble, that stuck in the movement bubble. That's probably my biggest criticism of him, if I could make one. What do you make of that?
I think that sounds 100% on point. Just both in kind of my experience with, quote unquote tanky groups, and sort of the cults of personality that can oftentimes form in them, and also just, the far left in general. Like, when you're at the center of a movement, like with Occupy and stuff, you can begin to get a little tunnel vision and not realize how large the diversity of opinion within the country is. And when you're sort of at kind of the ideological vanguard, you forget how many people are behind you and haven't really caught up. So that definitely makes a lot of sense to me, and especially somebody who's been put into a position of power. Like, one of the major critiques that I personally have about power in general, and why I think we should do our best, like, we shouldn't run away from power, but we should do our best to always question power and make sure that power as that is wielded or centralized is always justified. And it's because the act of becoming powerful changes you. Because we as humans understand who we are from the way the people around us treat us. The signals that you and my family and friends and everyone gives back to me is what lets me know who Brent really is, and it's what keeps me grounded. And that's, when you get celebrities, pulling a Kanye or pulling a Donald Trump, where they lose connection with reality, and and some of them regain that connection, and some of them burn out, and some of them become kind of sad cult leaders. So I think one of the big important things about this is to stay grounded. And one of the things that I like, and he stopped with this habit, but I think it would have been good for him to surround himself, or to continue to surround himself with people he disagreed with, and to continue to have these disagreements. It sounded like he wanted that, but he didn't quite know how to go about doing it, because if people are being punished for speaking out or being silenced, and then he comes and says, no, we need to have these arguments, he's right, but it's like, do as I say, don't do as I do. And
right. And I get that from his work. I feel like on some level he knew the group needed to be more democratic. He knew there needed to be free debate, but he also didn't want to give up his own power. That's how it looks to me. But again, I'm sure I'm making a lot of people mad, and there's a lot of people watching this right now seething and saying, "You're wrong, Caleb. You have no idea what you're talking about." And they have every right to say that. They have every right to say that, and they should go and make videos of their own explaining what they think is the true story. And that's one of the most disturbing things, is that, this is a person that had a huge impact. I mean, I first heard of Sam Marcy before I'd ever been to an anti-war demonstration. It was when the Iraq War was happening. And I read in my local newspaper that the anti-war rallies were being run by this Stalinist group called Workers' World Party, led by Sam Marcy. And that was like why you should never go to an anti-war rally, right? They were a national news story, and they've had a huge impact on the history of the United States as a group. I would say they've had a bigger impact than the RCP and other groups, but then there's so little material out there about who Sam Marcy was and what the party is. And now it's split into 5 different factions, at least, that I know of. I think there might be some more groups that are like breakaways and whatnot. And people might even consider me to be a breakaway, though I'll tell you, I disagree with him fundamentally. I'm no longer a Trotskyist. I would disagree with a lot of his approach to things, and that a lot of his international outlook, as much as I oppose American imperialism, and I think American imperialism is the main enemy, I don't think he really understood countries like Libya, for example, that were socialist but not Marxist. And, there are a lot of countries around the world that have broken free from Western imperialism but are not Marxist, but have more or less socialist economies. He didn't quite have a grasp of that. He also, on China, he really admired the Gang of Four. and he really thought that the rise of Deng Xiaoping, was just a tragedy, and that the Gang of Four were absolutely correct, and they were more revolutionary. And he was, on some level, he didn't seem to understand the problem socialist countries have with intellectuals and with thinkers and such, and that the Eastern Bloc was not a good place to be if you were a college professor or a scientist or a doctor, and that it is necessary, I think, in a socialist society to have a market sector, and that what the Gang of Four was doing in the final years of Mao's life, it was hell. I mean, those were bad years. Nobody remembers the last years of the Cultural Revolution as being anywhere a good thing. And I think he's in a little bit of denial, but that would fit with him. I mean, it seems like his narrative of the Eastern Bloc is that if they would just be more extreme, everything would be okay. If they just be more, and that he sees Trotsky, in his mind, Trotsky was the ultimate tankie. Right, Trotsky was 10 times the tanky Stalin was. That Stalin was a reformist compared to the real tanky Trotsky. That's kind of the way he interpreted the the Trotsky-Stalin split, and there's something to be said for that. I mean, it's not as simple nowadays. People that like Trotsky say, "Oh, he was just democratic." Well, Trotsky executed a lot of anarchists. Let's be real.
Indeed,
Trotsky,
he did.
There's a lot of. I mean, there's something to be said for that argument. But is that necessarily the answer, though? Right? I mean, would the Soviet Union have lasted if they had been as hardline as Trotsky might have wanted? I think the fact that the Soviet Union was unable to bend, and that's why it broke ultimately. They needed to be able to have reform and change in order to survive, and that there were things about the Soviet system that were stifling, that prevented it from really expanding and modernizing, and led to its fall. So I have a much different perspective than he does. I'll say that.
What this reminds me of a little bit is on the dialogue surrounding the anarchists in the Spanish Civil War. And we're sort of two schools of thought as far as things went. Like, there was a school of thought that people might have if they were in the conflict, or if they imagine themselves in the conflict and they don't 100% know a lot about it, which is, okay, we need to move slowly and carefully, and we need to build allies, and we need to make ideological compromises, and that was one school of thought. And then the other school of thought was, adelante, where you push the revolution as far and as fast as you can go, and basically blitz and defeat the fascists that way, and then move to world revolution from there. And it seems like Stalin was a little more on the slow kind of, let's deal with what we have in front of us and not piss off anybody around us as much as possible because they already hate us. And Trotsky going, no, what we need is a permanent revolution. We need world revolution, or else we're going to be isolated. And who was right? Well, they kind of both were right in the worst way possible, because we saw the Soviet Union was isolated, and then in a lot of ways, communism fell in a lot of ways in there. And you talked about Khrushchev giving that speech, and I think that speech was probably in a way signaling to the Western powers, but also I can see Khrushchev having serious problems, like personal problems with Stalin, just from what I knew about like the parties that Stalin threw, and forcing the people under him to drink until they until their tongues would loosen, or they'd get into fights, or they wouldn't be able to hold their liquor, and then just doing it again and again and again. That's going to build up a lot of resentment, and when you get the opportunity to respond to that in that position, you're gonna say like, hey, screw this guy.
Well, and what I also think is interesting is the Workers' World Party did seem to reinvent itself many times. I mean, at first they were this Trotskyist group that supported black nationalists, then they're a youth street fighting group, then they're stage managing the anti-war movement. And that what I've noticed about the existing Marcyite tendencies is that it's like the reinvention stopped when Marcy died. Right. And that it's just like, now, if you look at all of them, they all want to be movement stage managers, basically. And it's kind of sad in a way, because I feel like, if he had lived forever, he probably would have reinvented the party again and reinvented it again. And that's, if you read What Is to Be Done, Lenin says that if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics have to change in 24 hours. But if you look at the Marcyite groups, with a lot of them, their tactics haven't changed in 40 years. I mean, they're still
trying to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Here's the thing, like, in a way, this is like the struggle of the left, like of the revolutionary left, at least, is like, I looked back at the Spanish Civil War, and after reading about it and writing a movie about the life of Buenaventura Durruti, and I kind of asked myself, like, was there a way they could have won? And the more I think about it, the more I think no. I don't think it was possible at any point. There may have been, if they had blitzed hard enough and had been able to take over the war industry in the South, maybe. But even then, like, the fact is that the lack of international support, the fact that the liberal governments of the world would not support them against the fascists, and the fact that the USSR supported the Spanish Republic but not the anarchists, basically splitting the fascist opposition, ultimately leading to the defeat. And also, I think that there maybe was not. I think Stalin may have wanted to test his weapons a little bit more than he'd wanted a free Spain, which, I mean, he was gearing up for World War II. I can understand that move. But also, you look at it and you think it's like the struggle of the person who is ahead of their time. Because you, especially in today's like modern globalized world, you can't move forward without allies. And if you are too radical and too unwilling to compromise, then you're going to get isolated and you'll either do nothing or you'll eventually be suppressed. But at the same time, if you're too reformist, you get absorbed by the system, and you get blunted, and it gets, what you have done gets spit out as recuperation. So, I very much sympathize with his struggle, and it's a difficult thing that he was trying to do, and you almost see it with like the impossible goal of taking over the movement. Like, what does that even mean?
Well, and the thing is, it's like back in the 60s, there might have been something to that, right? Mm-hmm. But nowadays, if every communist group were united into one group, I still think we would be nowhere near having socialism in the United States. I mean, it's not a very good goal. And that now we're in this weird situation where what people call the movement is in some cases more pro-war than the average person is. The average person thinks the wars are no good. Trump campaigned saying he was going to stop interventions around the world.
And of course he didn't.
Yeah, right. But a lot of the people who go to liberal democratic rallies against Trump and stuff are more hostile to Russia, more hostile to North Korea, and more willing to support interventions than average Americans are. So, and again, that points to that he didn't quite have a strategy for reaching average Americans. It was this understanding that if I can just control the movement, I can take power. And the movement isn't the whole country. The country's a lot bigger than that, and that there's a lot of different viewpoints in the country and such. And that, that points to that criticism overall. But what's interesting is what you were saying before about the need to make allies and how we don't really understand it. That sounds a lot like Sam Marcy. Sam Marcy was as much as he was a Trotskyist, his mantra seemed to be, well, think about it from the Soviet leader's perspective. It's like, we have to understand the USA has the atomic bomb, and he seemed to, despite being a Trotskyist, have so much sympathy for the leaders of socialist governments and be trying to understand how they think. And that seemed to be a big part of it. It was like this Trotskyism with an understanding of why socialist countries do what they do that leads you to be more sympathetic to them. And that the real way to defeat quote unquote Stalinism is to have a world revolution. So there's no need for a Stalinist bureaucracy. That's probably how he would have put it. Is that if the Soviet Union hadn't been surrounded and under attack, there would have been no need for a Stalinist bureaucracy to develop. So the real way to show solidarity is to build an anti-imperialist movement here and tell people good things about the Soviet Union and let them see its better side. And that was kind of his perspective. Again, it was kind of Trotskyist perspective, but it was kind of taking Trotskyism in this very, very pro-Soviet sympathetic way. That's Marxism. And you don't see anything like it anywhere else in the world. Nowhere else in the world do you have a Trotskyist party that kind of morphs into the big Stalinist party. And nowadays, Tankieism in the United States has Sam Marcy written all over it. There's very few Tankies in the United States that haven't had some contact with the Marcyite groupings because, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the Communist Party USA kind of focused on supporting the Democrats and building kind of an alliance with the Democrats. And so the Workers' World Party was like the more radical version of the Communist Party that focused on building big rallies, right? And people talked about how the Communist Party USA was like the pro-Soviet party. The Workers' World Party was like the Guevaranist Party, like the Che Guevara Party or the Fidel Castro Party. They were in the Soviet camp, but more radical. That's how people see them. And people kind of compare them maybe to the movement for the revolutionary left in Chile. That's one party that people have compared them to. People have compared them to the Socialist Unity Center of India. Perhaps there's some other parties, but none of those parties are Trotskyist exactly. Marxism is a very unique U.S. trend, and what's weird is so many of the tanky parties have died since the fall of the Soviet Union, and especially since the 21st century began. But Marxism is very well alive and kicking, with many different interpretations and people fighting over what it means and all of that. It's very well alive. This man had a huge impact on the political left in the United States.
Yeah, I definitely believe that. It's very interesting. So a couple of things that have stuck out to me in this conversation overall. Him saying that the Jews should support Farrakhan, who's anti-Semitic, it strikes me like it seems like a disconnect. Like he doesn't have quite the idea. Like he doesn't understand how that sounds. But he may be making a really good argument and giving them like in good, but then at the same time, you're like, it's the same thing as like the pamphlets against Israel causing the kind of PTSD reaction. So you see times that he seems like he doesn't quite get people, and then other times that he seems like he really does understand a lot of people. And so what seems to me is almost he understands very well a certain part of the picture, and then other parts just completely elude him.
Right, and that seems to be the contradiction. He goes back and forth between kind of hiding his politics and just taking very popular, vague pacifist anti-war rallies to taking very, very hard lines. Like during the Iran hostage crisis, they had a rally supporting the Iranian hostage takers, right? And they had to have it in secret. They didn't even announce it. It was like a surprise rally, no press release, nothing. They did it like a surprise rally. And the argument that he made, he was one of the only speakers at the rally from what I understand. And he said, if a group of workers went on strike and kidnapped their boss, wouldn't we support them? And that was kind of the position about why you should support the Iranian hostage takers, right? Not a mass line, but but it kind of explained in this labor movement orientation. I think the reason his argument about why Jewish people should support Farrakhan is he would argue, I think what he argued in the article, I wish that article was on the internet. It's not, right? I mean, and that's why their archives should be up there so people can read, the man say it for himself. But he would argue that anti-Semitism flows from the same system that causes the oppression of black people. And that
definitely does.
And that leaders like Farrakhan, who mobilize black people for their own, freedom and independence, are helping dismantle that system. Even if they're confused about anti-Semitism, they're still on the right side. And that Jewish people as victims of anti-Semitism should realize that even though they're confused, the attack on him coming from the mainstream media is coming from a bad place of trying to keep black people down. That's how I think Sam Marcy would make that argument. I hope I'm representing it correctly. I wish his article was available so he could make it himself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and you can. There is a kind of sense to that, but also you think like, and I don't want to make this because I feel like this is a hasty comparison, but you don't say, oh, the communists should join with the fascists because they're both fighting imperialism or capitalism. Like you can't join with people that hate you. And like it would be great, honestly, if like Farrakhan and some of the other black nationalist organizations were able to look past that and to become more internationalist in their outlook and to realize across the aisle that there are, Jews are oppressed. Black people are oppressed. The workers are oppressed. We're all ground under essentially the same system. And the task of the left in a lot of ways is to take these disparate groups and unite them. And it would be wonderful if you could get them to unite, but it's also like you can't just do that. You have to build the bridge. You have to build that web of connections. You have to teach these people that not to hate and fear the tribe on the other side. So, like, I can. So it strikes me, and this is why I said it felt like he didn't have a full understanding of people. Is like he sees them involved in the same struggle, but he doesn't understand the way to make them see that they're involved in the same struggle, other than saying you're involved in the same struggle, which nobody believes. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, fascists might even say it, like Eric Stryker might go and try to court communists, you know, but it's a poison pill, because of what he really wants to do is not, you know, build revolution or build socialism. He wants to oppress minorities. So that's one thing. There was one other thing I did want to bring up, and this is so there's kind of a stereotype that anarchists have about tankies, and I'm not speaking about all tankies, obviously. This is just like, you know, the crude stereotype that gets built over interaction where you only see a part of a person. And, you know, there's definitely varying degrees of accuracy about stereotypes about anarchists and stuff. So if you look at right-wing libertarians seem to have the constant problem with hasty equivocation. Taxation is theft. The state is, it seems like they will take two very different concepts and they'll just stick them together and say, no, this thing is actually the same as this thing. The thing that I often see in tankies is that they have a problem with the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And they think that that is like the case. And that can be very true in war, when there is an outright, you know, violence going on. You know, obviously your enemy's enemy is helpful to you if they're fighting your enemy. But in politics, it's very much not the case. And, you know, we've seen again and again that when it's not outright war, and even sometimes when it is outright war, people oftentimes will hastily approve of things that they really should not be approving of, and the only reason that they do it is they have sort of this kind of very sectarian mindset. So I think that's the stereotypical like tanky blind spot, is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And it's interesting to see how he falls on that spectrum, because again, it's like you said, like sometimes he seems one way and then sometimes the complete opposite. He's a man of contradictions.
Yeah, I mean, the inability to see shades of gray, right? You know, if you criticize something about a socialist country, inevitably you'll get the response, yeah, well, what about? And they'll name something about the United States. Well, that doesn't really answer the question. What I do think is interesting is, you know, you mentioned Eric Stryker and all of that. When David Duke was running for the governor of Louisiana and had a very good chance of winning, Sam Marcy wrote a letter to the workers of the state of Louisiana, urging them not to vote for David Duke. And if you read the letter, right, it's beautifully written. And one thing he talks about, he opens the letter by talking about how a number of employers in Louisiana had written letters to their employees telling them, please don't vote for David Duke, it'll hurt the economy of our state. And he said, no, none of us like David Duke, but they had no right to send you that letter. Your employee has, your boss has no right to tell you who to vote for. That was an attack on your rights as a worker. And just kind of making the case, and he expressed deep sympathy for low-income white workers in Louisiana, and understanding why they might be confused to vote for some racist anti-Semite like David Duke, and urging them to not do that. And it's just a beautifully, beautifully written letter. I mean, you read it, it's just like, you could tell he put a lot of thought into it. And then he sent party organizers to Louisiana to distribute this letter in mass, you know, so there were all kinds of random people in Louisiana who got a copy of a letter from a leader of a communist party telling them why not to vote for David Duke. Now, I don't know if it convinced anybody, but it's a pretty wild story. And so, again, that contradicts my other criticism of him. On some level, he did realize there are red states out there and did want to reach out to average people. But yeah, Sam Marcy was a man of contradiction. And I think that his legacy is still being written largely. And I mean, he's certainly had an impact on my life as somebody who was in the group that he started for a long time. I mean, we shall see how things play out. I wish more of his material was available and people could discuss it more. But yeah, that's really, I mean, this is a man who probably more than anybody impacted American Tankieism.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and thank you for letting me know about this weird, amazing guy. Because, you know, it's really funny. Also, I feel like sometimes the black-red divide is a divide of personality, and I think that it's almost the divide between priests and shamans. So to give you an example, the way that anarchists organize usually is to just go organize. A lot of us don't have a plan, and it's very obvious. But passion and can actually make huge things happen, like Occupy Wall Street, for instance, which wasn't 100% an anarchist thing, but you get what I'm saying. That people just kind of grabbing something and running with it and trying to make the world a better place. There's merits to that approach, and then you kind of look at the and that merits all. It reminds me of the shaman, because the shaman is the priest in the culture that is still hunting, that has not settled down, and then you have the priests, which are an order that is the spiritual person in the culture that has settled agriculture. No one ordains a shaman. The shaman gains his spiritual powers by going out into the forest by himself, disappearing, and and having a mystical experience to a certain extent, and coming back from the wilderness with something that he's learned that he can use to help the tribe. Whereas the priest is a member of an order and builds and maintains the order and gets his spiritual power handed down to him from his superiors on high through this institution. And you kind of see these two approaches, both sort of the wild shamanistic approach of the anarchist and the much more priestly, orderly approach of the communist, of the Tankie. And so these are two like major things on the left that seem to have very similar goals and their own unique strengths and weaknesses and their own unique stumbling blocks. And I just find it fascinating because like you and I, we have very different personalities, as anybody who just looks at the two of us can tell. Of course, we're sitting here talking together about this, and you told me this awesome story, so thank you. Sure. But yeah, so I think kind of looking at the figure of this Sam Marcy, if he is indeed, if what you've told me about him is correct, he seems to be a very fascinating figure, and I think there definitely should be a lot more out about him, and it explains a whole lot, like a big missing piece of American political strategy and certain tendencies I've seen on the left, and even with people that I interact with online, even that I wasn't aware of before. So thank you very much. This was really fascinating.
Sure, it was a pleasure. Maybe we can talk about some anarchist leaders sometime. That would make a great conversation as well. So.
Oh my God, we need to do one on Buenaventura Durruti.
Let's do it. You can educate me all about him. That'll be a great podcast. All right. Well, like I said, I'm going to add video and such so that the audience can see what Sam Marcy looked like, video and such, and it should be good. So thank you very much. Everyone remember to check out the Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, right? Best comic book available these days. So.
I have an editor now. Scout has assigned me an editor, so I'm really excited. He's a great guy to work with. He's an old pro, and he's working with the second issue. We were pushing it along, getting it closer to publication. Also, if you guys haven't seen it already, I debated Sargon of Akkad, and it went surprisingly well, like oddly well. I think I might have gotten through to him a little bit towards the end. So definitely check that out on my channel, and if you can, please subscribe. We're up to we're above 730 subscribers, and I'd love to hit 1,000 very soon. So thank you guys very much.
All right, well, thank you.
And that's a great chapter in the history of the working class and in the history of the proletarian revolution in Russia and elsewhere.